Everybody. Very happy to welcome you all here today, where we will have Thomas Etheridge telling us about taking LCA one step further. How do business models impact environmental outcomes? Tom is an expert in the application of life cycle assessment, life cycle thinking, and carbon footprint analysis in support of business strategies, corporate sustainability, and sustainability reporting. He recently retired from HP after a 25-year career in which, for the last 10 years, he served as Worldwide Life Cycle Assessment and Carbon Footprint Program Manager. In this role, his responsibilities included helping to set the company's sustainability strategy, calculating the carbon footprint of HP's entire printing franchise annually, and using LCA to drive HP's circular economy goals. Tom pioneered the use of LCA on business models and the use of anticipatory LCA in support of product design, improvement, and market creation for new and existing products and services. He's also the co-founder of Equilibrio and holds a PhD in chemistry from the University of Chicago. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Holly, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar. I'm going to turn off my video for now just to preserve some bandwidth, but I'll turn it back on at the end when we start taking questions. So as Holly said, I spent my career at HP for much of that time managing the company's carbon footprint and life cycle assessment programs. And that involved a lot of trying to understand not only how our products affected our carbon footprint and environmental impact, but also how our business practices did. And what that led to was trying to understand how our business models then impacted those environmental impacts. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So with that in mind, here's just a general outline of what I'll be talking about. I'll do a quick refresher on LCA. I'm going to assume that most of the people here already know what LCA is, and that's going to be more just to set the context for the rest of the talk. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on what LCA is. I'll talk some about HP's circular economy strategy and how that fits into the business, because that obviously leads into a lot of our business models and how those business models are used in these studies. And then I'll give 3 examples, and these are all examples of actual LCAs that we ran at HP on business models for various versions of device as a service. So the first one is Instant Ink. You may have heard of it. I'll talk more about that, but that's where HP sends you cartridges instead of you having to go to the store to buy them. Managed print services, which is where HP would go into anywhere from a small business to a large office suite and install an array of printers and then manage those printers and all the supplies that go with them. And then finally, PC device as a service. This is one that at the time of this LCA was just a pilot project. And this is where instead of purchasing a PC from HP, you would essentially lease it for some period of time and return it to HP and get another PC. So those first 2, when we did the LCA, were already well-established businesses. So the business models were set, they were profitable, they were really booming. And so those LCAs were pretty backward-looking. We were looking at how those business models were affecting the outcome, the environmental outcomes of the business, and then trying to adjust it going forward. The last one, since it was a pilot program, was all based on what the business thought it needed in order for this to be profitable. So we set the LCA based on those parameters, and then as the business was, with the expectation that as the business developed, they could be adjusted within the profitability of the business model to optimize the environmental outcomes. And then finally, I'll talk about some conclusions. So first of all, this is all based on LCA, and I'm showing this slide really to set the stage in 2 ways. The first one is that at HP, all of our LCAs were ISO guided. We were very, very careful to make sure that they all complied with the ISO 14000 suite of standards, just to make sure that, one, we were doing it properly and we were treating our products as well as, if necessary, our customers, our competitors' products appropriately, and also just ensuring that we could talk about these and communicate them uniformly across the business and with customers as well. The other thing I want to show this slide for is to to get you to hopefully think a little bit differently about LCA. So LCA is always about the environmental attributes of something. So we still were doing LCAs of things, either a printer or a print cartridge or a PC. But what we adjusted around it was the scenarios by which HP either sold that product or delivered it to a customer for use. So it's still an LCA in the traditional sense, but what you have to think about is the variability came in how that was being distributed and marketed rather than specifically how it was sold. It's a subtle difference, but I think it'll make some sense as I go through this slide deck. The other thing to keep in mind is that at HP, we always used recipe as our LCA modeling protocol. And in it, of course, there are lots and lots of midpoints that it can report. And then there are a few endpoints that are generally reported as aggregate. In the slides I'm going to be showing you today, I'll talk mostly about these endpoints and then a couple of other things like cumulative energy demand, water, and global warming. The reason I put this up here is that, as many of you know who are experienced with LCA, it's really, really rare for an LCA to show improvements in every one of these categories. So if there's one thing I want you to get out of this talk today, it's that in each of these examples I'm going to show you, we found environmental reductions in absolutely every category. There were never trade-offs. And that really made us sit back and say, wow, what's going on here? Why is this happening? Is there something unique about looking at these products? Are we just getting lucky? Or is it something about the business models? And that's what will drive the conclusions that I'll be showing at the end of the talk. But again, the thing that really startled us all was that there were reductions in every single category without exception. Now I'll spend a minute talking about HP's circular economy strategy. And this is still its active strategy. And what it's based on is what we call the power of the inner loops. So as a manufacturing company, of course, we're making products for our customers to use and in various ways, either as the traditional make, use, and dispose model. We're trying to move away from that into the more typical ideas around circular economy, where disposal isn't really part of the equation unless it's absolutely necessary. And so there's several different layers of that, everything from then it just upgrades and constant maintenance so that the product itself isn't disposable at all, to products as a service, which is what I'll be talking about today, and then the more traditional and old style things like reuse and refurbishment and recycling, which we're all very familiar with. So what I want you to focus on is that everything we'll be talking about today is a product as a service. So this is something where the customer gets the product from HP, but HP still maintains ownership of the product itself. And by doing so, we're able to control the entire disposition of that product, from manufacturing all the way through to reuse or recycling. Okay, so now I'll step into some examples. The first one is Instant Ink. And what you'll see, I'll show 3 slides that are similar to this, one for each one of these business models. And the text that's on here is what the business model brings to the customer. In this case, Instant Ink was developed, one, to save the customer money since they're not having to buy those expensive ink cartridges, and 2, to reduce the biggest dissatisfier that our customers had around ink, which was not cost. It was actually the fear of running out of ink in the middle of a print job. So this was a program that was developed to make sure that a customer always had ink on hand at any time without having to worry about running out of it and having to jump up and run to Office Depot or something like that to get a cartridge at the last minute. What we found as we were doing it, though, was that it also saved a lot on ink and also saved a lot on packaging. But how did the program work? So this is a diagram for the 2 different ways that an ink cartridge can be distributed to a customer. On the left is the traditional model where the customer goes to a store or goes online and buys the cartridge. It's delivered to them, they use it, and then they take it, and hopefully they recycle it, but in reality, most inkjet cartridges went to landfill. On the Instant Ink side, what happens is your printer is hooked up to the internet, and it's talking to HP all the time, and in doing so, the printer is telling HP, hey, Tom's getting ready to run out of cyan ink. We should go ahead and send him another cartridge. And by doing so, the cartridge would be sent to the customer to be replaced at any time, along with an envelope to return the spent cartridges to HP. So that dramatically improved recycling rates, but it also dramatically reduced distribution. And you can see that sort of here, because if you look for the customer use, all this stuff is happening for distribution to the warehouse, the store, online, or whatever, before you ever get to customer usage. But on the Instant Ink side, it's a much smaller box. And within that box, it's actually pretty simple as well. So the cartridge is manufactured. It goes to a packaging facility. This is the North America model, obviously. And then it goes out to various distribution centers and then to the customer. And when I say distribution to the customer, this is through the mail. So you're saving all of that transportation costs, because you're now bulk delivery rather than individually driving to a car or running a couple of errands to pick up that cartridge. So we anticipated that this was going to have an effect on the environmental impact, but we were shocked at just how strong that impact was. So here are the global warming potential comparisons. So these are for black cartridges on the left, and for color cartridges on the right. And you see that in both cases, the difference is almost 2x. And almost all of that comes in this distribution portion. Manufacturing is the same, because HP doesn't do anything differently to manufacture cartridges going into this program versus going into traditional. They put more ink in the ones going into Instant Ink, so they don't have to ship as many out. But otherwise, manufacturing is the same. Packaging is a little bit different because you don't have all that bulky packaging that prevents theft at a retail store or makes it so it can hang on a shelf nicely and things like that. They just come in a simple cardboard box. So it made this huge difference. And as I said, we were stunned that it was that dramatic. Not only that, as I mentioned, it's that way across the board. In every single category, the reductions were sometimes as much as 80%, depending on the type of category, the type of cartridge and so forth. So the main observation is that it had lower environmental impacts across the board. And transportation, as I mentioned, was the biggest contributor. So by doing bulk delivery and reducing that transportation, it had the biggest effect. Packaging also had a strong effect, but not quite as high. So this does beg the question, though. There's the core assumption in that traditional business model that somebody's driving to go get the cartridge. Well, in the United States or North America in general, that's probably the case. But in places like Europe, not necessarily. A lot of people ride a bicycle. They live in more densely populated cities, so maybe they walk. So we said, well, wait a minute. How robust is this business model, or these results to that assumption that people are driving? So we said, okay, let's run the same analysis again and just assume that people walk. We're not putting any burden of actually getting in a car and driving to get a cartridge. And so we wanted to look and see if that still showed an effect. And indeed it did. So still, you see the scale over here has changed. The distribution has dropped dramatically, but still, Instant Ink led to a much lower environmental impact, even if the customer, in the traditional sense, walked to the store. So what this taught us was that distribution and packaging can have an enormous impact on environmental impacts across the board for a situation like this. And HP used this to help guide many of its packaging and distribution decisions for not only inkjet cartridges, but across the business. So from that, I'll move on to another print business model. This is managed print services. As I mentioned, this is where HP would go into typically some large office suite, say a bank or something like that, a post office, and supply a whole bunch of different printers to meet various needs across the business. So instead of somebody having to go out and buy those individual printers and set them up and understand how to do them and optimize them for where they should be located and how they should be used, HP did all that up front. And also, HP would come in and do the maintenance of the machines and supply the supplies, both paper and cartridges. So it really is a managed print service. In addition to not selling the machine directly to the customer, HP continued to own it and just manage the services around it. Now, what we wanted to do is say, okay, that's a well-established business model. It's a profitable business model, and we think it should have some environmental impacts. And it has some environmental benefits, and here's why. If you look at the typical carbon breakdown of a laser printer, what we find is that paper is the biggest contributor to environmental impact. Energy is second, and consumables are third. So these are all three things that can be controlled by managed print services. Production, you really can't, because it's the same printer going into any one of these situations. And transport's affected a little bit, but not really that much. It really is all around the use phase of the printer, which is about 75% of its carbon footprint. So the HP business model for this, as I mentioned, is essentially this. HP would come in and install the printer, provide support. Again, the printers are talking to HP all the time. So if a fuser is getting ready to die, for instance, the printer reports back to HP, and somebody comes and changes that fuser before it actually dies. That not only keeps the customer happier, but it also helps reduce random calls and interventions and so forth on the printer itself. I already talked a little bit about automated consumables delivery, and then, of course, removal of the old printer, which HP would then recycle. So one thing to keep in mind when I show you the results is that in this business model, HP was not refurbishing these printers. It was simply taking them back and recycling all the components that could be recycled. The doing it and refurbishing the printers was something we were looking at in the future, but that's not involved here. The other big thing is thinking about how this business model affected paper. It optimizes paper through the obvious one of making sure that the printers are set to auto duplex. It's amazing how few customers we have, even commercial customers, who forget to duplex, and that's the fastest way to reduce paper impacts. It also ensured that it was using a pull print system, and this is something that you may be familiar with. It's where you send a print job to a printer, but it doesn't print immediately. You have to go to that printer, and in the case of an office at HP, for example, you scan your badge in front of the printer, it pops up what print jobs you have available, and you select which one you want to print. The benefits of that are twofold. One, it reduces the number of jobs that are sent to a printer and then totally forgotten about. We've probably all been in offices before where there's a stack of things that people have printed sitting there that they've forgotten to come and get. The other one is it allows the person to only select that print job that they really want to print. And this takes care of those situations where maybe you're editing a document and you just say, oh, it's done, and boom, you send it, and then all of a sudden you look up and say, oh, look, the date's wrong. So now you have to go change that date and print it again. But when you get to the printer, you only need to print the most recent version or the latest version. All those other ones just stay in the cloud and eventually can be deleted. So you're not wasting paper from unused print jobs. And the other is it allows customers to easily communicate documents without printing. Yes, these are printers, and HP makes money in selling cartridges, and in this case, toner. But it also makes money in allowing customers to more easily communicate and use their devices. So this is a big way to reduce paper. And finally, it ensures that high-capacity cartridges are used in all cases. And this is important because on a per-page basis, the more toner you can get out of a cartridge, the less impact it has, because a toner cartridge, or an ink cartridge for that matter, can contain a huge difference in the amount of ink or toner that's in there. So finally, what are the results? Well, I've already told you a little bit. Again, we saw reductions across every single category, regardless of which ones. It's not as strong as the result that we saw in Instant Ink, but it's still substantial. And it makes sense because for Instant Ink, of course, the reductions came from reduced packaging and reduced transport, and those were the biggest contributors there. Here, you're not getting rid of paper, you're changing the usage a little bit. You're not getting rid of cartridges, you're changing the usage a little bit. And so the reductions are substantial, but they aren't quite as big as they were before. The nice thing about this was, though, that now we had data that we could go to our customers and say, hey, by using these managed print service models, we could go to our bank customers or our law firm customers and so forth and say, here's how we're going to help you reduce your carbon footprint through using managed print services. And the main thing that I forgot to mention was the way we set this LCA up was we looked at the same printers that could be sold either in the traditional transactional method or through management services. And also we got similar results for color printers. So it really was agnostic to printer type, printer volume, and several other aspects of the business. Okay, and the third one I'll talk about, and I'll spend a little more time on this one, is that device as a service model. And so this one, as I said, was something we had been thinking about for a long time, but we were just now starting to look at. And the reason was it took the business quite a while to understand how it would do this and be profitable. It was something we clearly wanted to move into to help HP meet its environmental sustainability goals. But obviously, as a business, it needs to be profitable. And once they established what that profitability, what those parameters were for the business to be profitable, we were able to do an LCA. So the device as a service model, I'll go into a little more detail in a minute, is about what you'd imagine. HP makes a piece, in this case a PC, delivers it to some customer, typically in a large office setting or something like that. The customer doesn't own the PC, but they have use of it for some limits of some period of time, as much use as they'd like. HP would optimize the PC delivery to what that customer needs. So it helps reduce the chance of the customer getting a lot more PC than they need, spending a lot of extra money, getting a lot of extra hardware, which has a lot higher environmental impact and so forth. So that optimization was a big part of the business model, both from the environmental side and from the business side. It also helped for maintenance. So that, again, the PC is at least letting HP know that, hey, I'm starting to have problems. The customer can let HP know it has problems, and immediately HP could have a replacement on hand. So you didn't have to worry about the typical warranty issues and delivery and so forth. And then finally, the PC at the end of some service period would come back to HP and be reused for another device as a service customer. So in this example, you can imagine that if you're an engineer at HP or something, or you're a doctor in a hospital, you might need a PC that has a lot higher capacity for computations and for graphics and so forth. But maybe if you're a technician in a place like HP, or you're using a computer to run some piece of equipment, you don't necessarily need the latest and greatest software or the latest and greatest hardware or computing capacity. So that's what would happen with the computers when they come back. Instead of being resold, they would go back to another device as a service customer who didn't need the latest and greatest. It would save that customer money, and it would also then reduce HP's need to manufacture more PCs. Now, you may say, well, that sounds a lot like, this sort of a device recovery thing, whereas HP could take products back and resell them. And we certainly do that. We've been doing that for years. But the big difference here is this is still a transactional service. The customer still owns the device, and we have to rely on the customer to bring it back to HP so that HP could then reuse it, recycle it, or whatever. There's nothing here that guarantees that the PC would ever come back to HP. A lot of the computer manufacturers out there have programs where, if you bring in an old PC, we'll give you a discount on a brand new PC. So HP would be happy to take like Dell PCs or Apple PCs in this service. And I'm sure Dell and Apple were similar. So it's a different situation. Yes, those business models still reuse the PC often and certainly recycle it, but it's not a device as a service, because you still have to count on the customer being willing to give up that PC at the end of the day or the end of the year. And that's where the real trick is. When we're talking about instant ink or managed print services, those are pretty easy to imagine how that would work. But for a PC, that's a very personal device or a very personal product for many people. That's my PC. It's got my stuff on it. And so that we found that that's overcoming that barrier was going to be the biggest aspect of making device as a service work. So how did this model work for the LCA? I've already mentioned in general how it worked. What we said was, okay, let's assume we're going to set the functional unit to use of this PC for 5 years. So within that 5-year period, if the PC has a 3-year life, it's going to have to come back at some point. So here's how the modeling looked. It's just the traditional, you make the PC, assemble it, wherever, get it to the customer uses it, but then instead of taking it directly to end of life or end of use, it would then come back to HP to be refurbished in whatever way necessary. For instance, scrubbing the memory, replacing the keyboard if necessary, maybe replacing a broken display, who knows, and then go back out to another customer. So in this case, the PC was assumed to have a 3-year life, but it was still the customer was using a PC for 5 years. So we modeled it this way, and we actually saw, again, very, very strong environmental impact benefits across the board. And this was a big surprise to us here because unlike the business model LCAs I showed you before, this one was new. It was based on what at the time were hypothetical parameters that the business thought it needed for this to be profitable. So now we were able to say, hey, here's a potential business model that could make money for HP, and yes, it is meeting our environmental goals after all. So this is probably one of the most exciting LCAs I ran at the entire time I was at HP. And the results come from where you would expect them. If you think about a PC, the vast majority of the impacts come from building that device, the display, the motherboards, and things like that. These are high-value materials. So the longer you can keep them in use, the lower the environmental impact will be overall. And it's exactly what we saw here, and that's what was driving the benefits. Now the question came up immediately when we started looking at this is, okay, how narrow are those parameters that we can get this? It's just, what if we change the lifetime of the PC? What if we change the refurbishment rate and all these other kind of things that were very, very sensitive to the profitability of the business model? And how did those affect the environmental outcomes? And what we found was it was extremely robust to all of the things that we thought would be important, from refurbishment energy. Obviously, you're going to have to use energy to refurbish PCs, reuse rates, manufacturing fail rates, and so forth. The only one that could change it was the lifetime. And that makes sense, right? Because if you're using it for less time, eventually you reach a point where it's because of all the background processes of actually refurbishing and reusing these PCs, it does become better just to buy a new one at very, very short lifetimes. But that's the only thing. All of the other components of this that affected the profitability of the business remained robust on the environmental impacts. And I'm just showing global warming potential here because all of the other impacts followed very closely. So with that, the bottom line that I want you to get out of this is that for these business models, at least these what we were doing at HP, showed environmental reductions in all categories, even the midpoints. And these are the only LCAs we did in the entire 12 years I was doing LCAs at HP that had that. Every one of the other ones had trade-offs somewhere. And so this was a huge aha for us in how we, as HP, modeled and delivered our products to our customers and fitted into our circular economy strategy. So in conclusion, I'll go back. These all fit into HP circular economy strategy, but they showed the effects in very different ways. The PC device as a service reduces impacts through avoided manufacturing and extended use of high-value materials, just what you'd expect. Instant Ink reduced impacts through improved distribution efficiency and reduced packaging or simplified packaging. And management services reduced impacts through more efficient use of the product and through reduced waste. So with that, there is a white paper we wrote that's actually out here that's got the address here that you can go out and read more about it and see where HP has gone with this since then. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Tom. And the questions have been pouring in.
Oh my, okay.
The first one is, why doesn't HP put more ink in the cartridges going to retail?
Because to do so, they're more expensive. And so cost of ink is a high sensitivity point for HP customers. And so those are available, and you can go out and buy cartridges that have just as much ink or almost as much ink as many of the instant ink cartridges, but they're a lot more expensive. So this was a way for a customer to get that same amount of ink without having to spend that money up front. And for a lot of small offices or homes, that also didn't make as much sense to do that, because if they aren't printing that much, then the cartridge could easily fail before they got done, and then the burden is on them to get a new cartridge, whereas this puts the burden back on HP.
Okay. What were the challenges you found in implementing the circular business model for the collection of used products?
That's a really good question. It's challenging in many, many ways. And the biggest challenges depended on geography. So in Europe, there was already a pretty robust system set up called WE, which is the Waste Electronics, I can't remember the rest of it. It was part of EU directives that required companies to take back their electronic products. Now it's generally stopped there. You couldn't, once the product got back to HP, there were certain guidelines for recycling it and so forth. But at least that helped HP in Europe establish some way of getting these things back easily. In the U.S., it was a little more difficult. But then again, since this was generally directed toward larger companies, so we would, instead of doing it to an individual or a small company, this program was set up to deliver tens or hundreds of computers to a larger office, in which case those companies tended to have IT personnel that would bundle it all up and get it back to simplify that whole problem.
Okay, thank you. And how do these business models help HP meet its environmental goals?
Well, they do that because as you saw, there's environmental reductions that all these showed. Well, every year when HP would work on its goals and either updating or understanding how we were meeting them, we started learning from these programs to understand how much impact they're having. And so that started getting baked into the environmental goals that we were using for the future. So once we were putting programs like Instant Ink in, we'd look at its adoption rate, what the reduction is, and figure that into our reported reductions. So it helped us out that way. It also helped us understand, well, if there's going to be a big market shift, like what if we have a global pandemic? What's that going to do to our environmental impacts or environmental impact goals? Well, this gave us the data to show how that might be affected and where we would need to adjust to still meet those goals.
Okay. So another viewer says, fascinating. To your knowledge, is HP using the results of these LCA studies to engage with its customers? And if so, how?
Absolutely. So if we go back to that slide I was showing here, this white paper right here is available on HP.com, and we direct customers to it all the time to show how what the environmental benefits are of these programs. This is a summary document that shows all three at a fairly high level. So we do it. We did. We use it regularly to talk to customers, especially as customers are getting more and more environmentally conscious and demanding environmental impact assessments on the products that are being sold. Did that answer the question? If not, please ask for clarification.
And another viewer says, from a greenhouse gas protocol perspective, if the device is a service, would the greenhouse gas emissions fall within HP's organizational boundary or the organizational boundary of the customer using the device? And then she has a follow-up that says, or is there a way in which these emissions are apportioned between HP and the customer?
That's a really good question, and I don't fully know the answer. As I said, like with device as a service, that was a new service when as I was wrapping up my time at HP. So I'm not sure just how that got incorporated. I know for managed print services and for Instant Ink, on Instant Ink, HP tended to claim all the credit there because most Instant Ink was going to small customers, either small offices or home customers. For managed print services, it gets a little murkier because, as I mentioned, we would often use those calculations to show a large office, again, say a bank or something, how this would reduce their carbon emissions. I wasn't ever part of the discussions on how those were apportioned between the customer and HP, so I can't answer the question any more accurately than that.
Okay, we'll take what we can get. And how are customers responding to the service business models?
They love them. Absolutely. Well, certainly Instant Ink has been a huge success. The uptake in that has been far, far higher than we expected. Managed print services was doing really, really well until the pandemic, when nobody's in the office and printing anymore. And so since I'm not at HP anymore, I don't know how that's been going. But my understanding on PC devices as service is that one has soared, again, because people are at home. This makes it a lot easier to deal with, if you've got a PC, dealing with maintenance and so forth, and making sure you get the one you want, and you're not paying all the money up front. You're paying a monthly or annual fee to use it and so forth. So the uptake in these has been huge. And remember, as I mentioned, these were all set up to be profitable businesses for HP. And then looking at the environmental aspects was not the primary driver. But the environmental aspects have certainly helped drive higher adoption. At least we believe it has.
Okay. And then someone asks, what other product areas do you think work well for devices as a service that aren't already happening?
Well, big ones. So other things that you might imagine from an HP standpoint for devices as a service are large format printers and big presses and so forth. So instead of somebody having to pay $1 to $5 million for an HP digital press, it would be leased and then as a device as a service that way. It's getting more closer to the traditional lease model than the device as a service for a PC. But if you're still talking about supplies and general maintenance and so forth, then it fits into that scenario nicely. I think outside of that, for other businesses, you can imagine for home appliances, again, because there's so many high-value materials in those products, that a lease model may be far better environmentally. And also, for cars, I imagine there's already LCAs out there that look at LCAs of leased cars versus purchased cars, but that's another one where you might imagine it. Again, for this, I think the biggest impacts that we saw came from either figuring out how to dramatically reduce the distribution impacts in the case of Instant Ink, or dramatically extend the life of the product for high-value materials so that you reduce the net impact of those materials.
Okay. What was the impact from internet usage for Instant Ink?
What was the impact from internet usage? Well, it's that whole program runs on internet. You can't be an Instant Ink customer and not have your printer hooked up to the internet. So it's entirely driven on that. I don't know that at least I was never involved in any studies that looked at the difference there and traditional for most of the printer usage. I think Instant Ink did increase usage or amount of printing in many cases, but in others it decreased it. So as I recall, it was a wash. But that also depended on the type of customer. For small business customers, it actually increased printing. But for home customers, it decreased it somewhat, if I'm recalling correctly. And remember, that's based on, I left HP early last year. And so as I understand, the pandemic has dramatically changed usage models for printing and PCs both. And I'm just not privy to how those changes look at this point.
Okay. And
actually, but one more thing on that topic. HP generally releases its environmental sustainability report in June. And I would imagine if they're still doing it in the same format as when I left, those kind of things will be in there in pretty good detail.
Okay, thank you. This question is a little bit hard for me to understand. How was the internal adoption of these new business models, and are the business model idea flowing around and ask what are the environmental impacts of it, or what kind of business model would reduce environmental impacts?
Well, the adoption of the business models themselves, in many cases, was rapid inside the company. So the way HP typically did business models, and I imagine most companies are this way too, is somebody or some group inside the company would have an idea for a new way to sell a product. It would get approval through management, it'd be piloted, and then we'd watch and see how well it worked. And in that case, all of these took off like gangbusters. Other business models it didn't, but they also didn't fit the circular economy things that I'm talking about here. Other than that, I'm not sure exactly how to answer the question.
Oh, okay. Well, they can ask some more if they want. And another question is, was recycling done in North America? In other words, what does responsible recycling entail?
So that is very dependent on the product. So HP recycles in all geographies, but those recycling rates are very, very different depending on geography. As most of you know, recycling rates tend to be much higher in Europe than they are in North America, and much higher in those two than in South and Central America and in Asia and Africa. Now, the disposition of those recycled products is very, very different depending on the kind of product. So for things like printers and PCs, printers are typically broken down and all sent to electronics recycling. PCs might be resold as refurbished units or might fit into the devices of service. The big one, though, that was really exciting is, again, with this Instant Ink program and HP cartridges in general, and that is we set up closed-loop recycling for inkjet cartridges, so that all cartridges collected by HP were broken down, and the plastic in them was sent back and made into new HP cartridges. And the loss in plastic was made up either by using PET water bottles from Haiti for those cartridges that have PET bodies, and using broken coat hangers from retail stores for those that had polypropylene bodies. So that's very, very different depending on the kind of product, and the rates are very, very different depending on geography.
Okay, and that person had a follow-up to the one you weren't sure was answered, and his question was geared toward when the environmental impacts were considered during the business model ideation and adoption process. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so thank you for that. So for Instant Ink and MPS, it was very much an afterthought, in that those were being driven purely on a business basis, and then we realized, oh, there's probably an environmental benefit here, let's take a look at it. For devices as a service, since that was new and HP was already very, very involved in understanding its environmental impact and reducing it, that was one of the first things they looked at. And so before that even went out the door, we were asked to do this LCA based on what the anticipated business parameters would be. So it just depends on the model. And I think with that said, I think HP is moving much more toward that latter. There's another LCA that I didn't talk about here that was also done by EarthShift, and that's on our 3D printing systems. And that one, since that was brand new, it's another one where they came to me and we got an LCA done as the product was in beta development, so we could understand where the hot spots were and work those out as much as possible before the product went out the door. And I know that's still evolving.
Okay. And how does a business model LCA differ from an anticipatory LCA?
So the difference there is, and it's sort of subtle. An anticipatory LCA is one that you do where you say, okay, here's the LCA I'm going to do. Now, what if I fiddle with these different parameters? What's the outcome? So maybe if I can get recycling rates to increase, if I move to fully renewable energy instead of traditional coal or petroleum based. Those are anticipatory LCAs because you're trying to anticipate what the effects might be. A business model LCA is similar, but remember, it's all based on the business parameters that were set by the company. So you're not asking the question of, oh, how will the environmental impact change if I do these things? It's how will the environmental impact change if the business model changes in a way that still keeps it profitable. So what it's doing is looking at those business parameters and understanding how much margin the business has to be in its environmental goals and as well as its profitability goals.
Okay. And another question is, can you comment on the business benefits of these new models and how much more profitability, increased market share, et cetera?
Unfortunately, I can't. Some of that obviously is confidential, and also I've been gone from HP for over a year now, so I can't really comment on just how profitable it has been. But at a very high level, HP, all the way up to the CEO, talked regularly about the fact that environmental impact and sustainability is not only a moral and societal imperative, but it's a business imperative. It's absolutely critical that we do it. And they wouldn't have been saying that if they didn't believe it was affecting the bottom line as well.
That is true. Well, Tom, it's been a very informative session with you here today, and I want to thank you for your time in answering all these questions. And I'd like to invite you and everybody else to our next Brown Bag webinar, which is on June 10th next month, where we will talk about an anticipatory LCA approach to evaluate and improve the climate benefit from emerging carbon capture and utilization technologies. And that will be given by Dwarak Ravikumar, who's a scientist at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So thank you all, and I will close this. And people have told me it's an excellent talk, Tom. So,
well, thank you. Thank you, everyone.